Version 2's developing metagame was one of the most interesting parts of Honkai Star Rail throughout that time, and likely the reason why players also enjoyed the game so much back then compared to now. It felt like every new unit that came out had the express purpose of expanding one of the 3 combat engines: damage over time, follow-up attacks, and super break. In particular, the follow-up attack and break engines became the focal point of the metagame and the main teams to vie for, with damage over time and to an extent Acro and Hypercarry representing the 2 minor ones. Altogether, there were basically 4 main combat engines to build towards. Among them, people took a liking to the break engine for generally being the most free-to-play friendly, as 2 of its premier characters, Gallagher and HMC, were afforded to us at no cost, making building a team very quick and easy. Firefly's popularity also lent itself to elevating the standard of break teams, initially being viewed as a competitor to Akron by way of Super Break's incredible base damage. Couple that with a consistent stream of break-oriented units like March 8, Linksha, Fugue, and Rappa, people thought break would be here to stay, since why else would they go out of their way to release so many of them? Fast forward to the present, however, and the amount of attention given to break, or lack thereof, is beginning to resemble that of damage over time. Most if not all the Chrysosairs have primarily focused on personal damage and the new Remembrance path, leaving the break engine to be neglected all throughout version 3 so far. But is it more than just a lack of updates, or is break suffering from a bigger problem? Let's talk about what happened to the engine and whether or not it can make a return. For the sake of posterity, I'll briefly recap on what break is and how it's utilized by the premier engine, Super Break. Whenever enemies take damage of an element listed above their HP bar, their toughness gauge will also decrease. Upon being dropped down to full, they get staggered, taking a huge amount of damage up front, losing the next turn, and taking 10% bonus damage from all sources until they recover their toughness gauge. Depending on the element that resulted in the break, they'll also be inflicted by a damage over time debuff or some other type of inhibition, typically resulting in delaying their action and effectively allowing your team to get more turns in before the enemy gets to counterattack. Breaking the enemy's toughness is an integral part of HSR's combat, and often the method by which you counter the majority of the game's boss mechanics. Whether you are or aren't playing a break team, it's in your best interest to break enemy toughness at the earliest opportunity, though granted that sentiment has become less important over time in favor of just killing enemies outright. Break units are those who specialize in accelerating the speed of toughness gauge reduction, the impact of the initial break damage itself, and/or the supplementary effects that come with being broken, ranging from severity to duration. While every character is able to apply weakness breaks, some can do it faster, better, or for longer. That would be the long and short of breaks in HSR. Now, to give a brief overview of the roster itself. While break-oriented units have always been a thing dating back to version 1.0, break as an engine didn't really manifest until early version 2. Technically, it started in 1.6 with the release of Ranmei, whose skill granted everyone in the party 50% break efficiency, meaning if an attack did 30 toughness damage, it would do 45. Further, Ranmei's ultimate would increase break damage taken by enemies by way of all-type res pen and extend the duration of weakness breaks, while dealing her own break damage on top of that. Though many saw her as a general buffing unit, which she is mind you, Ranmei would later be characterized by a break buffing ability. Version 2.1 brought in the sustain option for break teams in the form of Gallagher, whose attacks dealt pretty serious toughness damage and also applied a debuff to enemies, making them take increased break damage. Being a 4-star and also giving everyone a free copy during that time made people very interested in the break engine as a whole, and they wouldn't have to wait very long to find out where it would take them. Version 2.2 and 2.3 saw the release of Harmony, Trailblazer, Boonhill, and Firefly, another support and 2 DPS units. With this, the first generation of break teams was officially established. HMC in particular brought with them a brand new mechanic known as Super Break. Essentially, Super Break allows all subsequent attacks dealt to a broken target to reapply the break damage they initially took when they first got broken. By stacking tons of break effect on your relics and taking advantage of Gallagher's Bespada debuff, players were able to deal unbelievable amounts of damage through just about anything, even basic attacks. What made this team so appealing was how not only was the main attacker doing damage, but literally the whole team. HMC, Ranmei, and Gallagher were contributing 6 figures on their own, leading to some of the highest overall DPS in the game when done correctly. Now, even though Boonhill had a different form of synergy with Break in the sense that he scaled off toughness damage, not break effect, the fact that he and Firefly were pushing out millions of total damage per turn portrayed the engine in quite the positive light. To reiterate, 2 of its primary drivers, Gallagher and MC, were completely free, giving them a significantly lower investment floor than Acro and Hypercarry, damage over time, or follow-up attack. Break would continue to improve throughout the better part of version 2. 2.4 oversaw the release of March 8, who was more of a follow-up attack support but had the capacity to supplement breaks as well. Then in 2.5, Linksha came out, whom I can only describe as a 5-star version of Gallagher basically. Up until this point, the only thing Break was in short supply of was AoE damage, since Firefly was more for blasting and Boonhill was expressly single target. Once again, thankfully they didn't have to wait very long. 2.6 brought in Rappa, an AoE-focused breaker who quickly established herself as one of if not the strongest pure fiction and apocalyptic shadow carries during that time. You could even argue she was every bit as strong as Firefly, if not more so, who alongside Facial and Akron were the gold standard for main attackers. If that wasn't enough, 2.7 would have Tingyun make a return to the game, but this time as a 5-star break support. With their debut, the Break engine obtained its most powerful support lineup yet, Lingsha, Fugue, and Runmei. They were so overwhelmingly powerful that just these 3 alone could destroy endgame content. I'm not exaggerating, Lingsha, the sustain, could deal more damage than Firefly if you built her correctly. For the 4th party slot, naturally most players elected to play Firefly into this team, completely demolishing everything the game had to offer, regardless of the game mode. Alongside the FAR team, Facial, Aventurine Robin, and Topaz, these 2 lineups were Starl's best and the pinnacle of version 2's metagame as they enter version 3. With how seemingly indomitable they were, the community expected Super Break to hold their position at the apex tiers for quite a while. If only we knew how wrong we were. Version 3 quickly veered into another direction, leading to not a single new break-focused unit being released at this time. In addition to expanding on the new Remembrance path, the Chrysosairs all went into more of a traditional attacking style, with the likes of Phynon, Castros, Mide, and Aglaya prioritizing personal damage output and having their own custom mechanics. Moreover, they were also brought in with a considerable jump in strength compared to version 2, which is an alarming occurrence when you consider how fast the game's power scaling accelerated throughout version 2, only for version 3 to take it even further. More pressing is a sudden change of heart. Why exactly did Hoyo opt to go for personal DPS, not just in Enfori's characters but also for the units outside of it like Madame Herta, Saber, and Archer? How did we go from a new break-focused character every patch to not a single one coming out in almost a year? A lot of that has to do with the limitations of Break and the inherent problems that affect just this engine and nothing else. The single biggest reason behind Break's disappearance in version 3 ties to its greatest strength also being its greatest weakness. Break is totally insulated from everything else in the game, despite being a core element to Star Rail's combat insofar as the vast majority of battles revolve around playing towards it. The mechanics by which Hoyo designed Break to function around are pretty hard to actually support. First and foremost, the means of achieving breaks. Breaking enemy toughness is not dependent on how much the attack does. Rather, every damaging ability in this game has its own toughness break value. If you go on Pride Wind, you can see to the right of the energy gain there's a break value. That determines the toughness damage enemies take when struck by an attack. To this day, it is the only thing responsible for lowering that white bar above the enemy's head. Currently, there's only one way to increase that: break efficiency. Break teams commonly rely on enemies being broken to achieve their DPS potential. In other words, up until enemies get weakness broken, the team is doing virtually 0 damage. Then there's the initial weakness break. Break damage comprises practically all of the team's DPS. However, unlike traditional attacks or even damage over time, break damage has an entirely separate calculation, one that disregards all conventional offensive parameters. It does not scale up crit damage, nor does it scale off elemental damage like the ones you get from your planar ornament. Even more, it doesn't scale off general damage either, like the ones you get from Harmony supports. Biggest of all, it doesn't even scale off attack. The only things that increase break damage are base damage, ability multiplier, break effect, break damage increase, for example Gallagher's debuff, enemy defense and resistance reduction, and by extension defense and res penetration, and for super break, the toughness damage of the ability in question. That is all, nothing more. What this implies is that in order for you to play into a break-oriented win condition, and in order for Hoyo to conceptualize a break unit, you have to go down an altogether different method of designing abilities and whatnot that renders break damage unable to synergize with other forms of combat. Even damage over time can scale off attack or damage increases because they scale off of the character themselves. Break, however, does not. On one hand, break teams are world-renowned for their incredibly high damage floor, being able to output hundreds of thousands of damage without having to really invest in anything. On the other hand, with there being so few ways to augment one's DPS outside of break effect on relics, the ceiling of break is also correspondingly low, forcing you to rely on just the base numbers of the characters you have available and having the knock-on effect of constraining the archetype. More than anything, Hoyo wants a character to have a high pull value since more pulls equals more profit. Break units contradict that notion by limiting their value to only break teams. Even if Yuke, for example, is an insanely busted character, she will always be worse than a general buffing support like RMC, Robin, or Sunday, because those units can buff all manner of teams. Follow-up attack, hypercarry, you name it. A person can be compelled to pull for Sunday for multiple reasons, whereas you have only one reason to pull for Fugue. Initially, this wasn't a problem since players had 2 free units, but now that the game is power creeping rather quickly, the next generation of break that comes out, if it comes out at all, will be a hard sell for people unless Hoyo forces a break meta. Thing is, they can't do that because of the other problems with the engine. I would say Break's a very low agency combat engine. In layman's terms, most if not all of its mechanics are out of your control, drastically undermining the consistency of the archetype. Chief among them is the fact that it's enemy focused. If you recall in my video on Nihility vs Harmony, I talked about how player focused units perform better since you have complete control over what your team will be, what that team does, and when they do it, whereas enemy focused units can fluctuate depending on what type of enemy they're fighting, how many they're fighting, and so on. The same applies here. Break is an enemy focused mechanic. A very strong one, yes, but enemy focused all the same. For one, all enemies have different weaknesses. Even though the Break engine has ways to bypass that, with some units having universal toughness reduction or being able to implant weaknesses, the point remains you're still contingent on enemies having the same elements you do to some extent. While this may affect all teams, like I said, applicably speaking, Break teams do 0 damage until enemies get weakness broken, so they're even more dependent on that. Secondly, enemies can have ways to either lock their toughness gauges from being reduced, or they might not have any elemental vulnerabilities at all throughout some parts of the fight. Whatever form it takes, the end result is that Break teams can run the risk of getting screwed over just because the enemy boss or whomever has a mechanic that prevents you from breaking them, or they can recover from weakness break too quickly, or a wide variety of things. One more issue, and it's kinda shared with the Dot engine, is how whenever there's a new enemy or the boss has an additional phase, your team's DPS goes from 100 back down to 0 until you break them again, something a conventional attacking team never has to worry about. They can keep fighting at full power consistently throughout the course of a battle so long as they can maintain buffs. The motivation behind all these properties being given to enemies to hinder Break teams has to do with how overpowered Break is as a whole. I'll remind you, it's not just a source of DPS, it's also a form of damage augmentation in that broken enemies take 10% more damage by way of toughness itself having 10% damage mitigation. And of course, lest we forget, breaking enemies delays their actions, completely shutting down certain boss mechanics and giving your team more turns to go ham on them before they get a chance to do anything, allowing for Break teams to forego sustain since they can play to the one-shot enemy before they one-shot you win condition. In the same fashion that Hoyo wanted to stop Freeze and Genshin, justifiably they don't want breaks to trivialize Star Rail, so in response they add protections to stop you from 100 to 0ing their toughness meter just like that, blocking toughness gauges, forcing you to kill side minions to add weaknesses to the main boss, making toughness gauges bigger so you take longer to break them, what have you. In particular, increased toughness gauges on enemies causes Break teams to get power creeps twice. They have to deal with not just HP inflation but toughness inflation, making them get doubly screwed over by the game's increasing difficulty. It would be fine if we had ways to circumvent that, like relics having increased break efficiency or in general giving us more ways to scale break teams, but the underlying problem is that breaks in general suffer from being a binary mechanic. Enemy either breaks or doesn't break, resulting in a balance dilemma where break teams are either game-breakingly overpowered or totally useless, never in between. That might be the reason why Hoyo doesn't want to release more break units. They're extremely volatile and prone to either overextending or falling short. Comparatively, they can release a general DPS unit and fine-tune their numbers to be just where they want it to be. One last thing is that Break's perception in the metagame was overall quite inflated, or to put it bluntly, I think Break was overrated. Much like Denjo and Genshin, Break teams were strong because the base damage of Break was so high relative to the power scaling of characters during that time. Now, however, the game's reached a point where units have long since passed that range of damage. A couple hundred Ks is almost nothing now. Everyone's trying to go for millions. Back in the day, Runmei, Agency, and Gallagher each doing a 250,000 mattered a lot when the main DPS units were only doing 750k to 1 mil. But when Archer or Casters is doing 5 million in a single hit, no one really cares about the support doing 250k. In that sense, break teams were good but only in relativity, not objectivity. Although having said that, Hoyo can remedy this issue by simply giving us a new generation of break units. By the time you see this, Hycillans will already be out, and she'll no doubt give Kafka and Black Swan a big race in the meta. All we realistically need is a version 3 break DPS to supersede Firefly, Rappa, and Boothill, and we should be good to go again. But it would be nice if they gave an overhaul to break as a whole though, more ways to scale through equips and such. What about you guys? What are your thoughts on break? Do you believe the archetype has a chance to make it back in the meta, or do you think it's good that it's not? For now though, if you enjoyed the video, I'd appreciate it if you'd like to like and subscribe. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter @VarSarim, join my Discord server, and check out my other archetype discussions if you haven't yet. But till next time, thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care.